A mountain man was still a virgin at 40, until 12 Amish beauties asked for shelter. He thought his lonely cabin in the high country would stay silent forever. But one winter night, as the storm howled like wolves, 12 desperate women appeared at his door, begging for warmth, food, and protection. At first he was too ashamed, too broken, too unused to human touch. But as the fire burned low, their hymns filled his cabin and his heart. Then came the whispers in town, men with greedy eyes, a sheriff with iron keys in his pocket, a railroad agent who would stop at nothing. The women weren't just homeless travelers. They carried secrets, land, and hope worth fighting for. Now the mountain man must decide: stay hidden in shame, or rise as the protector they believe he is. Will he be strong enough to face the guns, the fire, and the lies? Or will his fear condemn them all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled against the cabin walls as Mark Boone stepped back, holding his rough-hewn door open. Snow swirled past him into the warmth of his home, while the 12 Amish women hurried inside, their dark dresses and white bonnets dusted with crystalline frost. Their boots made soft thuds on his plank floor as they entered, and the scent of wet wool filled the air. Mark's hands trembled as he secured the door against the storm. He'd never had visitors before, let alone women. His throat felt tight as he turned to face them, ducking his head to avoid their eyes. The cabin that had always felt spacious enough for one now seemed terribly small. Amanda Fisher stood nearest to him, her quiet presence somehow filling the room. "We thank thee for thy Christian charity," she said, her voice steady despite the bone-deep weariness evident in her face. "God has surely guided our path to thy door." Mark nodded, unable to find words. The other women huddled together near his pot-bellied stove, their faces pale with cold. Some were barely more than girls, while others showed the lined faces of hard experience. All looked exhausted. "I reckon you'll want to warm yourselves," he managed to say, moving to add more wood to the stove. The familiar task helped steady his hands. "Got some rabbit stew cooking." "Not much, but you're welcome to share." "That's very kind," Amanda said. She turned to the other women, speaking in a gentle but firm tone. "Sisters, let us remove our wet things and help our host prepare the evening meal. We must not be a burden." Mark watched in amazement as the women organized themselves with quiet efficiency. Wet bonnets and shawls were carefully hung to dry. Some began helping with the stew, while others arranged their bedrolls in neat rows along the walls. Their movements were graceful, purposeful, without the chaos he'd feared. "Mr. Boone," Amanda said, approaching him where he stood awkwardly by the stove. "I hope we don't impose too greatly, but might we bring in some supplies from our wagon? We have flour and dried goods that could supplement thy provisions." He nodded quickly, grateful for something useful to do. "I'll fetch them. You ladies stay warm." The thought of them struggling through the deepening snow troubled him. Outside, the storm had intensified. Mark's legs drove through the drifts as he made his way to their wagon. The horses had been unhitched and led to his small barn, where they'd have shelter with his own mount. Inside the wagon, he found carefully packed barrels and boxes. He carried them to the cabin in several trips, his powerful frame making light work of what would have exhausted most men. When he returned with the last load, the cabin had transformed. The women had somehow created order from the chaos of their arrival. A pot of tea steamed on the stove alongside his stew pot, which now smelled richer with the addition of dried vegetables from their stores. Two of the younger women were kneading bread dough on his table, while others mended tears in their traveling clothes by lamplight. "We hope thee doesn't mind," Amanda said, noting his surprised expression. "We thought to make ourselves useful." Mark shook his head, amazed at how they'd brought life to his sparse home. "No, ma'am. Don't mind at all." He set down the last barrel and retreated to his usual corner, uncertain of his place in this changed space. The women worked together seamlessly, speaking softly in Pennsylvania German when they needed to communicate. Mark watched them from his corner, feeling like a bear who'd suddenly found his cave filled with doves. His size had always made him feel awkward, but now he felt especially conscious of it, trying to make himself smaller as he moved about his own home. Amanda seemed to sense his discomfort. She approached him again, her manner direct but gentle. "Mr. Boone, we understand this must be unusual for thee. We don't wish to disturb thy peace." He met her eyes briefly before looking away. "It's no trouble, ma'am. Just not used to company is all. Call me Amanda, please." She smiled, and something in his chest tightened. "We've fled difficult circumstances in the East. We seek only peace and a place to practice our faith freely." Mark nodded, understanding more than she might guess about seeking peace away from others. The isolation of his mountain home had been his shield against a world that had never accepted him. Yet something about Amanda's quiet strength made him want to help, to be worthy of the trust these women had placed in him. As evening deepened, the cabin filled with the aroma of fresh bread and simmering stew. The women arranged themselves around his table and on his few chairs, some sitting on their bedrolls. Amanda led them in a quiet prayer of thanksgiving, their heads bowed beneath their caps. Mark stood awkwardly until Amanda gestured to an empty space at the table. "Please join us, Mr. Boone. We would be honored to share this meal with our host." He settled carefully onto the bench, conscious of how it creaked under his weight. One of the younger women served him a bowl of the enhanced stew and a thick slice of fresh bread. The simple food seemed transformed by the presence of others to share it with. As they ate, the women spoke quietly among themselves, occasionally including Mark in their conversation with gentle questions about the area, the weather, and his knowledge of the mountain. He answered as best he could, his responses growing slightly less hesitant as the meal progressed. He learned that they had been traveling for weeks, seeking a place far from the troubles that had driven them from their Pennsylvania home. Amanda spoke of their hope to find land where they could build a new community, one true to their beliefs but free from the persecution they'd faced. Mark found himself studying Amanda when she wasn't looking his way. Her face showed wisdom and care, but also a deep tiredness she tried to hide from the others. He recognized in her the weight of responsibility, of carrying others' needs alongside one's own. After the meal, the women insisted on cleaning up despite his protests. They worked efficiently, making his few dishes and pots shine as they never had before. As they prepared for sleep, Amanda approached him one final time. "We thank thee again for thy kindness," she said softly. "We've prayed for guidance in our journey, and finding thy cabin in this storm feels like an answer to those prayers." Mark shifted uncomfortably at the mention of prayers. His own faith had grown uncertain during his years of solitude, though he still read his Bible by lamplight on lonely evenings. "Storm's likely to last a few days," he said instead of addressing her religious reference. "You're welcome to stay until it's safe to travel." Amanda's eyes showed understanding of all he left unsaid. "We're grateful. And perhaps," she hesitated, then continued with gentle directness, "perhaps God has brought us here for thy sake as well as ours." Before Mark could respond to this unsettling suggestion, she had turned away to help arrange the sleeping area. He watched as the women settled onto their bedrolls, their movements growing slower with exhaustion. Amanda checked on each one, speaking soft words of encouragement before finding her own place to rest. Mark climbed to his small loft, leaving the main room to his guests. As he lay in his bed, listening to the storm rage outside and the soft sounds of breathing below, he felt the walls he'd built around his life beginning to crack. The simple presence of these women, their quiet strength and faith, stirred something long dormant in his heart. He thought of Amanda's words about God's purpose in their arrival. For the first time in years, he found himself forming a genuine prayer, asking for guidance in this unexpected situation. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, his dreams were filled with the sound of gentle voices and the smell of fresh bread in his once lonely cabin. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin a different kind of warmth had taken hold. Mark Boone's solitary world had been irrevocably changed in the space of a single evening, and though he couldn't yet see where this change might lead, he felt a strange mix of terror and hope at the possibility of something new. The women moved cautiously into Mark's cabin, their shawls and bonnets dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor. Amanda Fisher's quiet voice guided them, directing the younger ones to remove wet outer garments, while the older women gathered near the crackling hearth. Mark stood back, pressed against the wall, watching as his solitary home filled with more life than it had known in 20 years. "Sarah, Rebecca, see to the cooking if you would," Amanda instructed, her calm authority bringing order to the chaos. "Mary, help the others with their stockings. We must get everyone warm and dry." Two women immediately moved to Mark's cooking area, examining the stores he had on hand. They found cornmeal and began preparing a simple mush, their movements efficient despite their exhaustion. Others gathered near the fire, carefully arranging wet stockings on the stones of the hearth to dry. Mark felt his chest tighten with an unfamiliar anxiety. His cabin, usually so ordered and predictable, had transformed into something foreign, yet he couldn't stand idle. Moving with deliberate care to avoid startling anyone, he retrieved his spare blankets from the trunk near his bed. They were rough-worn but clean, and he offered them wordlessly to Amanda. "Thank thee," she said, accepting them with a gentle smile that made his ears burn. He turned away quickly, focusing instead on the practical task of melting snow for drinking water. The large iron kettle felt familiar in his hands as he filled it with fresh snow from outside and hung it over the fire. The cabin slowly filled with the comforting smells of cooking cornmeal and warming bodies. Steam rose from damp clothes, and the constant murmur of soft voices created a gentle backdrop to the crackling fire. Mark found himself gravitating toward the door, overwhelmed by the presence of so many people in his space. When the cornmeal mush was ready, the women gathered around his table and the nearby floor space, balancing bowls on their laps. Amanda blessed the simple meal with quiet words of gratitude, and they ate in near silence, each spoonful a testament to their exhaustion and relief. After the bowls were cleaned and put away, several of the women began to sing. Their voices were low at first, barely above whispers, as they shared hymns in their Pennsylvania German tongue. The unfamiliar words floated through the cabin like a gentle breeze. Then they shifted to English, and Mark recognized some of the old songs from his childhood. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, and that saved a wretch like me." The familiar words stirred something deep in his chest, and he slipped outside onto his covered porch. The storm had intensified, thick snow falling in silent curtains that obscured the world beyond his cabin. He stood there, breathing in the sharp cold air, trying to make sense of the strange turn his life had taken in just a few hours. He heard the door creak behind him and knew without turning that it was Amanda. She moved to stand beside him, her presence somehow both unsettling and comforting. "I haven't properly thanked thee," she said softly, her voice barely carrying above the muffled sound of the storm. "If thee hadn't found us when thee did." She left the sentence unfinished, but they both understood what she meant. Mark shifted his weight, uncertain how to respond. "Couldn't leave you out there," he finally managed. Amanda was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall. "We left Pennsylvania 2 months ago," she said, her voice taking on a deeper solemnity. "There was a cave-in at the mining operation near our settlement. We lost." She paused, gathering strength. "We lost our menfolk. Husbands, brothers, sons. 8 good men." Mark turned slightly toward her, struck by the grief in her voice. "After that, things became difficult. Those who remained thought to decide our fates for us. They meant well, perhaps, but—" She straightened her shoulders. "We chose to seek our own path instead, to build something new, somewhere far from those memories." The weight of their vulnerability struck Mark hard. 12 women, alone on the frontier, carrying such loss. He thought of the dangers they'd already faced, and those that still lay ahead. His hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. "You're welcome to shelter here until the storm passes," he said, the words coming out gruffer than he intended. "I'll take the loft. You and your people can have the main room." Amanda turned to face him fully then. In the dim light spilling from the cabin windows, her face showed both weariness and strength. "Thee has already shown us more kindness than we dared hope for. We will not forget it." And inside, the women had prepared their bedrolls on the floor, arranging themselves in a careful pattern that left pathways to the door and fire. Amanda gathered them together before sleep, and her clear voice rose in prayer. "Lord, we thank thee for thy provision in our hour of need. We thank thee for leading us to this shelter and for the kindness of thy servant who has taken us in. Watch over us through this night and guide our path in the days to come. Amen." Mark stood in the shadows near the loft ladder, his head bowed despite himself. He hadn't prayed properly in years, but something about Amanda's simple words reached past his defenses. As the fire died down to glowing coals, Mark climbed to his loft. The familiar creaks of his cabin's timbers mixed now with the soft sounds of breathing from below. He lay in his bed, staring at the darkness above him, acutely aware that his solitary life had been breached. Whatever happened after the storm, he was now bound to these women's fate, if only through the knowledge of their existence and their need. The wind moaned outside, driving snow against his cabin walls. But inside, for the first time in decades, Mark Boone was not alone. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with hymns sung in voices both foreign and familiar. The fire popped below, and somewhere in the darkness someone sighed in their sleep. Mark turned onto his side, listening to these new sounds in his once silent home, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and he knew that this night of shared shelter was only the beginning of whatever path God had set before them all. Morning arrived with the sound of ice-laden branches groaning under their frozen burden. Mark woke before dawn, as was his habit, and lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of gentle breathing from below. The events of yesterday rushed back, and he felt his heart quicken at the reminder that his solitary life had been so suddenly disrupted. He climbed down from the loft with careful steps, trying not to wake his guests. A few faces turned toward his movement, but most of the women still slept, huddled beneath their blankets near the dying embers of the fire. Amanda was already awake, sitting straight-backed near the window, her Bible open in her lap. She nodded to him as he moved toward the door, and he returned the gesture, grateful that no words were required so early. The morning air bit sharp and clean as he stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline white. Icicles hung like glass daggers from his eaves, and the forest stood silent under its heavy blanket of snow. Mark made his way to the woodpile, now partially buried. He'd need more wood with so many people to keep warm. The familiar rhythm of swinging the axe helped settle his thoughts, each stroke precise and purposeful. The sharp crack of splitting wood echoed through the still morning air. He was loading his arms with split logs when he heard the cabin door creak open. The smell of coffee drifted out. Someone had started breakfast. Inside, he found the cabin transformed from its nighttime arrangement. Bedrolls had been neatly stowed, floor swept, and several women worked quietly at various morning tasks. Two younger women tended the cook fire, where a pot of coffee bubbled and cornbread baked in his cast-iron skillet. Amanda approached him as he set down the wood. "We hope thee doesn't mind. We've taken the liberty of preparing breakfast. We cannot repay thy kindness, but we can at least contribute to the work of the household." Mark shifted uncomfortably at her formal words. "No need to," he began, but Amanda held up her hand. "Please, we are not ones to sit idle while others provide for us. We will work to earn our keep, however temporary our stay might be." Her quiet dignity made argument impossible. Mark nodded, retreating to his familiar corner to watch as the women moved about his cabin with surprising efficiency. By mid-morning, his usually simple home hummed with activity. Some women mended clothes with neat, precise stitches, while others swept floors and organized his scattered belongings with careful respect. A large pot of water boiled on the fire for laundry, and the air filled with the clean smell of soap. Mark found himself drawn into their industry despite his natural reticence. He showed them where he kept his tools, helped move heavy furniture for cleaning, and carried water from the snowmelt barrel. For the first time in years, he felt useful beyond his ability to hunt and survive alone. When they gathered for the midday meal, Amanda sat beside him at the table. As they ate the fresh cornbread and beans, she began to speak of their journey west. Her voice was steady, but Mark could hear the strain beneath her words as she described their flight from Pennsylvania. "We thought to find shelter with other settlements along the way," she said, breaking her cornbread into small pieces. "But word had somehow spread ahead of us. 12 women traveling alone. In every town there were men who saw us as merchandise." Her hands stilled. "They tried to barter for us like cattle at market. One man offered 4 horses for the youngest among us." Mark's hand tightened on his cup until his knuckles showed white. The thought of anyone treating these dignified women as property made his stomach turn. Without speaking, he made a silent vow that such treatment would never touch them while under his protection. After the evening meal, Mark knew he needed to ride into Durango for supplies. Feeding 13 mouths would quickly deplete his stores, and he wanted to be prepared if the weather turned again. He saddled his horse as the sun began its descent, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. Durango's main street was quiet in the late afternoon, just a few people hurrying between buildings in the bitter cold. Mark tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his presence. The shopkeeper, old Joe, looked up in surprise. "Mark Boone, ain't seen you down from that mountain in near 2 months." The old man squinted at him. "Must be something important to bring you to town in this weather." "Need flour and salt," Mark said shortly, moving toward the barrels at the back of the store. "Coffee too, if you've got it." "Heard tell you got yourself some company up there," old Joe said, his voice carefully casual. "Wagon full of women, they're saying. Young ones at that." Mark kept his face neutral as he measured out flour into a sack. They needed shelter from the storm. The bell rang again as several men entered the store. Mark recognized them as regulars from the saloon across the street. They made a show of browsing the shelves while stealing glances his way. "Say, Boone," one called out, "you must be rich in brides up there. Might be willing to share the wealth with your neighbors?" Laughter followed this comment, but it held an edge that made Mark's shoulders tense. He paid for his supplies without responding, loading them quickly into his saddlebags. The saloon door opened as he mounted his horse, spilling lamplight and noise onto the street. The saloon keeper, a red-faced man named Burke, leaned in his doorway. "Don't be selfish now, Boone," he called out, "and plenty of good men down here could use a wife." Mark turned his horse toward home, but a new voice stopped him. Sheriff Clay Dobbs stepped out of the shadows beside the saloon, his badge catching the last light of day. "Might want to consider your position careful like, Boone," the sheriff said, his tone friendly, but his eyes hard. "Strangers don't tend to prosper much in these parts, especially ones who don't share their good fortune." The threat in those words was clear enough. Mark nudged his horse forward without reply, but his mind churned with worry as he rode through the gathering dusk. The town's reaction confirmed his worst fears. The women's presence was now common knowledge, and that knowledge brought danger with it. The ride home seemed longer than usual, his saddlebags heavy with supplies and his thoughts heavier still with the implications of the town's response. When he finally caught sight of his cabin, warm light spilled from its windows and the sound of singing drifted through the cold air. He paused at the edge of the clearing, listening. The women's voices rose clear and strong against the darkening sky, a hymn he half remembered from childhood. The melody spoke of trust in divine protection, of faith in the face of tribulation. For a moment he sat motionless in the saddle, letting their song wash over him. Inside, the women barely paused in their singing as he entered, though Amanda's eyes followed him as he stored away the supplies. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over the scene. Women seated at their work or gathered near the fire, their faces peaceful despite all they had endured. Their voices filled every corner of his once silent cabin with harmony and hope. Mark took his usual place in the corner, watching as they continued their evening tasks. The tension from town slowly began to ease from his shoulders, but he couldn't shake the memory of the sheriff's warning. These women had found shelter from one storm, but he feared there were others gathering on the horizon, storms of human making, far more dangerous than any weather. The singing continued as night settled fully outside, steady and sure against the darkness. Mark listened, his heart divided between the peace of this moment and the knowledge that their sanctuary might soon be threatened. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the snow-covered landscape glittering like diamonds in the early light. Inside the cabin, Amanda watched Mark organize his morning tasks with methodical precision. She had noticed how he seemed to find comfort in routine, and she waited until he finished his breakfast before approaching him with her proposal. "Mark," she said, settling onto the bench across from him, "we've been thinking about ways to contribute more substantially to the household." She smoothed her apron, a habit born of nervousness, though her voice remained steady. "We're all skilled with needle and thread. Perhaps we could sew quilts for trade?" Mark looked up from his empty plate, surprise evident in his features. "Quilts?" "Yes. Good quilts fetch fair prices, and we could help provide for our keep." She glanced around at the other women, who had paused in their morning tasks to listen. "Do you have any fabric we might use?" "Even scraps would serve to start." Mark's brow furrowed in thought. "Got some fabric stored away. Hide pieces, too, from tanning. In the storage shed out back. He hesitated, then added, "Never thought they'd be much use to anyone." Amanda's face brightened. "Would you show us?" Mark led them through the squeaking snow to a weathered shed behind the cabin. Inside, neatly organized shelves held his supplies, tools, leather goods, and several boxes of fabric pieces left from trading over the years. Amanda's eyes lit up at the sight of the materials. "This is perfect," she breathed, running her fingers over a stack of cotton pieces. "With these and the hides, we could make sturdy quilts that would sell well." Together, they carried the boxes back to the cabin. The women quickly organized a sewing corner near the best window, arranging their workspace with practiced efficiency. Soon, the cabin filled with the rhythmic sound of needles pushing through air. "Baber taxir." Berk and the soft murmur of conversation. Mark found himself lingering longer than usual after his morning chores, drawn by the atmosphere of peaceful industry. The women worked in pairs, some cutting patterns while others stitched precise lines. Their quiet laughter and gentle hymn singing transformed his usually silent home into something warmer, more alive. Amanda looked up from her work to find him watching. "Thank you for your kindness," she said softly. "You've given us more than just shelter. You've given us hope." Mark felt his face flush, but for once he didn't turn away. A small smile tugged at his lips as he nodded in acknowledgement. By early afternoon, Mark needed to ride into town to deliver his weekly pelts. The trading post owner had been a reliable customer for years, and Mark couldn't afford to miss a delivery, especially now with so many mouths to feed. The town seemed different today, more people on the streets, unfamiliar faces among them. Mark noticed a cluster of well-dressed men outside the hotel, their clothes marking them as city folk. Their presence made him uneasy. As he tied his horse outside the trading post, he overheard fragments of conversation from two men passing nearby. "Railroads moving through sure as sunrise," one said. "These mountain folk won't know what hit them." "Easier to relocate the simple ones first," his companion replied. "Those who won't put up much fuss." Mark's hands stilled on the reins. He'd heard rumors of the railroad's expansion, but nothing concrete until now. Inside the trading post, the owner seemed distracted, barely glancing at the pelts before naming a price lower than usual. "Take it or leave it, Boone," he said gruffly. "Times are changing." Mark accepted the reduced payment but lingered in town, listening. In the saloon, he heard his name mentioned, followed by coarse laughter. "Them Amish women won't be hard to convince," someone said. "Simple folk, easy prey. Just need the right moment." Mark's jaw clenched. He left without finishing his drink, the words easy prey echoing in his mind like a warning bell. The ride home seemed endless. When he finally reached the cabin, he found Amanda alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. "There's trouble coming," he said without preamble, dismounting. He told her what he'd overheard, about the railroad agents, the threats barely veiled in casual conversation, the dangerous intentions toward simple folk. Amanda listened quietly, her face composed though her hands gripped her shawl tighter. When he finished, she surprised him by showing no fear. Instead, her eyes held a familiar determination. "Then we must become stronger," she said firmly. "Not in their way, with violence and threats, but in our way, through community and faith." She turned toward the ridge beyond the cabin, pointing to a dark shape against the sky. "Do you see that old church up there?" Mark followed her gesture. The abandoned chapel had stood empty for years, its windows dark and roof partially collapsed. "Been empty since before I came here," he said. "Mining camp church. They all left when the silver ran out." "It could be more than that now," Amanda said, her voice growing animated. "It could be our sanctuary, our gathering place. A symbol that we aren't just hiding, but building something new." Mark frowned, doubt creasing his forehead. "It's barely standing." "But it could stand again," Amanda insisted. "May I show you what I mean?" The sun had nearly set, but Amanda was already reaching for the lantern hanging by the door. Mark hesitated only a moment before nodding. They walked together through the deep snow, their boots breaking through the crusty surface with each step. The lantern light swung between them, casting long shadows across the white ground. Neither spoke as they climbed the gentle slope toward the ridge. The old church loomed before them, its weathered boards silver gray in the fading light. Amanda held the lantern higher as they approached. Through the broken windows, the flame's glow flickered against the interior walls, creating an almost ethereal effect. "Look past what it is now," Amanda said softly. "See what it could be." Mark studied the building with new eyes. Despite its current state, the basic structure remained sound. The foundation stones stood firm, and most of the main beams appeared intact under the sagging roof. "The walls could be repaired," he found himself saying. "Roof needs work, but the timber's good around here." Amanda smiled, and in the lantern light her face shone with quiet joy. "Yes." And inside, imagine, benches filled with families, children learning their letters, women teaching each other skills. She turned to face him fully. "A place where all are welcome, where strength comes from standing together." Mark felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. The vision she painted seemed to hang in the cold air between them, as tangible as the lantern's warmth. "Would take work," he said slowly, "lots of it." "We are not afraid of work," Amanda replied, "and we have faith that God provides helpers when the cause is just." They stood together in the snow, the lantern casting their shadows against the church's weathered walls. Through the broken windows, Mark could almost imagine the building as it might become, filled with light and life again, a beacon of hope on the ridge. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility. Then a gust of wind made the lantern flame dance, reminding them of the lateness of the hour. "We should head back," Mark said quietly. "Getting colder." Amanda nodded, but her eyes lingered on the church. As they turned to descend the ridge, their footprints in the snow marked a clear path between the cabin and the old chapel, a path that seemed to promise it would be well-traveled in days to come. The morning after their lantern-lit visit to the church, Mark woke before dawn. He stood in his doorway, watching the pink light creep over the snow-covered ridge. The old church's silhouette stood dark against the brightening sky, like a challenge waiting to be met. By breakfast, he had already gathered his tools: axe, saw, hammer, and the box of rusty nails he'd been saving. The women finished their morning prayers quickly, eager to begin. Amanda organized them into teams with quiet efficiency, assigning tasks that made the most of each person's strength. "Sarah and Ruth, you'll start clearing snow from the path and steps," she directed. "Mary and Rebecca, gather pine boughs for sweeping. The rest will help me inside once Mark ensures it's safe to enter." Mark nodded, impressed by her practical approach. He led the way up the snowy trail, his long strides breaking a path the women could follow more easily. The morning air bit sharp and clean, their breath rising in white puffs. At the church, Mark tested each step of the old porch carefully before allowing anyone to follow. The wooden doors creaked open reluctantly, years of disuse evident in their protesting hinges. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through broken windows. "Lord have mercy," Amanda whispered, but her tone held more determination than dismay. She pulled a kerchief over her nose and mouth. "We'll need every broom we can find." Mark moved through the space methodically, testing floorboards and support beams. Most seemed solid enough, though the roof would need significant work. "Main beams are pine," he said. "Good strong wood. Built to last." The women worked with quiet intensity, sweeping decades of dust and pine needles from every corner. Outside, the sound of shovels scraping against stone meant the path-clearing team was making progress. Mark began removing the most damaged boards, the sharp crack of his prying bar echoing through the valley. By midday, sunshine streamed through cleared windows, illuminating the progress they'd made. The church's bones showed stronger than expected beneath the years of neglect. Amanda stood in a shaft of light, her face bright with satisfaction as she surveyed their work. "We'll need fresh timber for the roof," Mark said, coming to stand beside her. "I know where there's good straight pines not far." "God provides," Amanda replied simply. She turned to him with a practical gleam in her eye. "How many men would you need to help with such work?" Mark considered. 2 or 3 strong backs would make it easier, but I can manage alone if need be." "You won't be alone," she said firmly. "We may not have men's strength, but we have willing hands and determined hearts." Over the next days, they fell into a rhythm. Mark would leave at dawn to fell trees, dragging logs back with his horse. The women cleared more debris, stitched curtains from fabric they'd brought west, and began crafting an altar cloth from their finest linen. Each evening, they returned to Mark's cabin exhausted but hopeful. One afternoon, as Mark was shaping roof beams with his axe, the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful industry. A group of townsfolk rode up, led by Sheriff Dobbs. Their laughter carried a mocking edge. "Well, look what we have here," Dobbs called out, reining his horse to a stop. 12 bonnet girls and their lonely giant, playing house with the Lord. Mark's grip tightened on his axe handle. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the church entrance where several women worked. Amanda emerged from the doorway, her stance calm but firm. "We're not playing at anything, Sheriff. We're doing God's work, restoring his house." "Railroad's already bought this land," one of the riders sneered. "Whole ridge is marked for clearing come spring." "Then we'll pray for the railroad," Amanda replied steadily, "as we pray for all who would threaten widows and orphans under God's care." She drew herself up, and though she stood a foot shorter than Mark and 2 feet shorter than the mounted men, her presence seemed to fill the space. Her voice carried clearly as she quoted scripture. "Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction." The sheriff's face darkened. "Bible verses won't stop progress, woman, nor will they change the law." "Perhaps not," Amanda agreed, "but they remind us of a higher law, Sheriff, one that commands us to care for the least of these." Her quiet dignity seemed to deflate their bullying spirit. Even the sheriff appeared unsure how to respond to such calm conviction. After a moment of awkward silence, he wheeled his horse around. "Don't get too comfortable," he warned, "that spring ain't far off." The riders departed, their horses' hooves kicking up snow. Mark realized he was still gripping his axe white-knuckled. Slowly, he forced his fingers to relax. "I reckon you're braver than me," he said quietly to Amanda. "I was ready to swing this axe if they'd moved wrong." Amanda shook her head. Violence invites violence. Faith and dignity often prove stronger than force. She touched his arm gently. "Though I thank God for your protective heart." The women gradually returned to their tasks, but the afternoon's mood had shifted. They worked closer together, voices softer, glancing occasionally toward the trail to town. Mark found himself doing the same as he shaped beams, his ears straining for the sound of returning hooves. That evening, back at the cabin, no one seemed eager to sleep despite their physical exhaustion. Amanda brought out her Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. The women gathered close as she began to read from Psalms, her voice steady and comforting in the lamplight. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble," she read. "Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." Mark sat slightly apart as usual, but found himself drawn closer by her words. The familiar verses took on new meaning in her voice, speaking to their present troubles while promising ancient comfort. He watched her fingers move across the pages, sure and gentle like everything else about her. For the first time in more years than he could count, Mark felt truly guided. Not just safe in his solitude, but led toward something larger than himself. The feeling both frightened and thrilled him, like stepping onto ice that proved stronger than expected. Amanda looked up from her reading, meeting his gaze. In the lamplight, her eyes held understanding and something more, a shared recognition of the path stretching before them. Difficult, but right. Mark nodded slightly, accepting whatever challenge lay ahead. The night deepened around the cabin, dark and cold, but inside, the warmth of fellowship and purpose kept the shadows at bay. One by one, the women retired to their pallets, leaving Amanda and Mark sitting in comfortable silence by the dying fire. The Psalms lay open on her lap, its pages glowing golden in the fading light. The winter wind howled fiercer as January deepened its grip on the Colorado highlands. Inside Mark's cabin, the woodpile dwindled steadily, and the flour barrel echoed hollow when Amanda scraped its bottom with the measuring cup. She caught Mark's eye across the room and he nodded, understanding the silent message. "Reckon it's time to make a supply run," he said, his deep voice quiet in the morning stillness. "The quilts you ladies made should fetch a fair price." Amanda folded her hands in her lap. "I'll come with you," she said. After a moment's thought, she added, "And Sarah, too. She has a good eye for quality in trading." Mark's shoulders tensed at the thought of bringing the women into town, but he knew Amanda was right. They couldn't hide forever, and the quilts were their handiwork to sell. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow," he agreed. "Best to get there when the streets are quiet." That evening, they carefully wrapped 6 quilts in oilcloth, protecting the intricate stitching from snow. Each one told a story in fabric, pinwheel patterns, flying geese, and morning stars sewn with patient care. Mark watched the women's hands smooth each fold, remembering how those same hands had transformed his bachelor cabin into a home over these winter weeks. Dawn broke steel gray and bitter. Mark hitched the wagon while Amanda and Sarah bundled up in their warmest shawls. The other women gathered to see them off, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. "The Lord keep you safe," one whispered, and the others echoed, "Amen." The wagon creaked through fresh snow, Mark's horses picking their way carefully down the mountain trail. Amanda sat beside him on the bench, while Sarah huddled in back with the quilts. None spoke much, saving their warmth against the cutting wind. Durango stirred to life as they arrived, smoke rising from chimneys and shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks. Mark helped the women down from the wagon, conscious of curious eyes watching from windows and doorways. They made their way to the general store where Mark had always found fair dealing. Inside, Amanda and Sarah carefully unwrapped their quilts, displaying them on the counter. The storekeeper's wife gasped at the fine stitching. "Why, these are beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the patterns. "Such delicate work." But before they could begin bargaining, the door crashed open. A group of ranch hands swaggered in, their spurs jingling on the wooden floor. "Well, look who's come to market," one called out. "The mountain man's brought his harem to town." Coarse laughter followed. Mark felt his fists clench, but Amanda's calm voice cut through the mockery. "We are Christian women seeking honest trade," she said clearly. "Nothing more, nothing less. Would you deny us that simple dignity?" Her steady gaze and quiet authority seemed to shame them. The men shuffled their feet, suddenly awkward in their cruelty. One by one, they found reasons to leave the store. The storekeeper's wife clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Don't mind them, dears. Now, about these lovely quilts." They negotiated a fair price, trading the quilts for flour, beans, coffee, and other necessities. As Mark loaded the supplies, the grocer slipped him an extra sack of potatoes. "My wife was raised Mennonite," he said quietly. "We know what it is to be strangers in a strange land." The kindness brought unexpected warmth to Mark's chest. "Much obliged," he managed to say. The return journey felt lighter somehow despite the loaded wagon. Sarah hummed hymns under her breath, and even Amanda's usual gravity softened into something like contentment. They arrived home to find lamplight glowing in the cabin windows, and the sound of singing floating on the evening air. Inside, the other women had gathered around the hearth, their voices rising in harmony on an old German hymn. The melody spoke of hope in darkness, of light yet to come. Mark helped unload the supplies, each sack and barrel carefully stored away. The singing continued, weaving around them like a blessing. He caught himself humming along as he worked, the tune settling into his memory like it belonged there. Later, after supper had been cleared away and most of the women had retired to their pallets, Amanda lingered by the fire. Mark sat in his usual chair, whittling a piece of pine without much purpose. "Some of the women worry," Amanda said softly, watching the flames. "They fear they're a burden to you, taking up your space, eating your food." Mark's knife stilled. He studied the wood shavings at his feet, choosing his words carefully. "They ain't no burden," he said finally. "Truth is, I never knew what this cabin could be until you all came. It was just walls and a roof before. Now," he gestured to the room around them, where signs of life and care showed everywhere. Neat bundles of dried herbs hanging from rafters, clean curtains at windows, the smell of fresh bread still lingering. Now it's alive. They're singing, they're working, they're praying. It's made something new here. Amanda's eyes softened in the firelight. She reached out and touched his arm briefly, the gesture so light he might have imagined it. But the warmth of that touch stayed with him long after she withdrew her hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Mark nodded, not trusting his voice. The spot where her fingers had rested seemed to burn through his sleeve, marking him in some indefinable way. The next morning, he rode into town alone to check for mail. Outside the telegraph office, he overheard raised voices. The sheriff stood arguing with a railroad agent, a yellow telegram fluttering in his hand. "Within weeks, you say," Dobbs demanded. "Winter ain't even half done." "Orders are orders," the agent replied. "All parcels marked for acquisition must be cleared by early March. No exceptions." Mark's heart pounded. He knew the church land was among those parcels. The thought of Amanda and her flock being driven out into the bitter end of winter sent a surge of protective fury through him. That night, long after the women had gone to sleep, Mark sat alone by the dying fire. His Bible lay open in his lap, though he barely saw the words. Instead, he prayed silently for wisdom, for strength, for some way to shield these gentle souls who had brought such life to his solitary world. The flames flickered low, casting his shadow large against the wall. Outside, wind moaned through pine boughs, and snow fell steady and soft. Mark thought of Amanda's quiet courage in the store, her brief touch by the same hearth. Something had shifted between them as surely as winter was shifting toward spring. Whatever came with the railroad men and their parcels of paper, he knew he could no longer stand alone. He glanced toward the corner where Amanda slept, her breathing deep and peaceful. Partner, he thought. Not just a guest to shelter, but a partner in whatever battle lay ahead. The word felt right, settling into his heart, like a key, turning in a long, rusted lock. Mark stood at the cabin door before dawn, watching his breath cloud in the bitter air. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, coating the world in pristine white that would soon be marked by footprints and wagon wheels. His eyes traced the familiar path down to Durango, where thin wisps of smoke already rose from morning fires. Inside he could hear the women stirring, their soft voices and quiet movements a comfort he'd grown used to. But the peace felt fragile now, threatened by the railroad's plans. He turned back into the warmth of the cabin, his mind set on preparation. "We need to be ready," he announced at breakfast, his deep voice gentle but firm. "Those railroad men won't wait for spring thaw." Amanda looked up from serving porridge, her clear eyes meeting his. "What do you suggest?" "First, more firewood than we'd ever reckoned to need. Then trenches through the snow, making paths we can travel quick if trouble comes. And signals, lanterns posted where we can warn each other fast." The women listened intently as he laid out his plans. Some looked frightened, but none objected. Amanda's calm presence seemed to steady them all. "We'll divide the work," she said, rising from the table. "Sarah and Rebecca can help stack wood. Mary and Ruth know about storing food. They'll start taking inventory. The rest will help with the trenches and signals." She turned to Mark. "Show us where to dig first." They worked through the morning, Mark demonstrating how to cut clean paths through the deep snow. The women formed teams, their black dresses stark against the white drifts as they shoveled and packed the snow. By midday, a network of trenches connected the cabin to the church and several lookout points. Amanda organized their supplies with careful efficiency. "We'll need to ration," she told Mark as they checked the root cellar. "But God has blessed us with enough to share, if we're wise with it." Mark nodded, touched by her determination to help others even in their own uncertain times. He watched her count sacks of flour and dried beans, her fingers moving in silent calculation. "There's something else we should consider," she said finally, looking up at him. "The local native people. We should invite them to worship with us at the church." Mark stiffened slightly, surprised by the suggestion. But memory stirred. A day years ago when he'd been caught in a blizzard, half frozen and lost. A Comanche man had found him, shared food and shelter, guided him to safety. The man had asked nothing in return, only saying in careful English that all souls were brothers in the storm. "Reckon you're right," Mark said slowly. "Might be they'd stand with us too if trouble comes. But how do we reach them?" "Jacob Turner, the trader who brings mail sometimes, he knows the Ute families in the valley. He could carry our invitation." Mark agreed, and the next time Turner's wagon creaked up the trail, Amanda gave him a carefully written note. The trader promised to deliver it, though his expression showed doubt. They continued their preparations while they waited for a response. Mark patrolled the ridge each dawn, watching smoke rise from Durango's chimneys, alert for any unusual movement. Amanda led the women in prayer morning and evening, her steady voice carrying promises of deliverance and protection. One evening, as Mark returned from his patrol, he spotted unusual movement near the church. His heart quickened until he made out familiar figures, Amanda and several women lighting lanterns in the windows. As he approached, he heard singing, floating through the cold air, hymns in German and English mixing with the wind. The door opened as he reached the steps, spilling golden light onto the snow. Amanda stood in the doorway, her face glowing with welcome. "We had visitors today," she said softly. "Come see?" Inside, Mark found an unexpected gathering. 3 Ute families sat among the women, sharing plates of cornbread and beans. Children played together in one corner while adults talked in a mixture of languages, gestures, bridging what words couldn't span. An elderly Ute woman was teaching some of the Amish women to weave baskets from pine needles. Across the room, Sarah demonstrated quilting patterns to two younger Native women, their heads bent together over bright squares of fabric. "They came this afternoon," Amanda explained. "They brought dried meat and berries to share. We've been learning from each other." Mark watched in wonder as the two groups mingled, finding common ground in practical skills and simple fellowship. He noticed several townspeople had ridden up to observe, their faces showing surprise and uncertainty at the peaceful scene. The evening deepened into shared songs, Ute melodies joining with German hymns in an unusual harmony. Mark sat near the back, feeling his usual awkwardness fade as the music wrapped around him. Here were people from different worlds choosing friendship over fear. Later, walking back to the cabin under starlight, Amanda spoke softly. "Thank you for trusting my idea about this. I know it seemed strange at first." Mark was quiet for several steps, considering. "Never thought I'd belong anywhere," he finally admitted. "Spent so many years alone, I figured that was just my lot. But seeing everyone tonight, working together, sharing food and song," he trailed off, struggling to express the unfamiliar feelings. Amanda touched his arm lightly, her voice gentle. "God doesn't waste any life, Mark. Not even solitary ones. Perhaps all those lonely years were preparing you for this time, when we would need your strength and wisdom." Her words stirred something deep in Mark's heart, a warmth he hardly dared examine. He ducked his head, grateful for the darkness that hid his expression. They reached the cabin where lamplight welcomed them home. The other women were already inside, talking excitedly about the evening's events and making plans for future gatherings. Mark stood back, watching Amanda move among them with quiet authority, helping settle everyone for the night. His feelings for her had grown beyond simple admiration, though he kept such thoughts carefully hidden. She was so far above him, educated, confident, a natural leader. Yet somehow she valued his opinion, trusted his judgment, treated him as an equal partner in their growing community. The cabin gradually quieted as the women retired to their pallets. Mark banked the fire for the night, stealing one last glance at Amanda's serene face before climbing to his loft. Outside, snow began falling again, but inside was warmth and belonging, gifts he had never expected to receive. The late winter weeks brought subtle changes to the mountain community. Each morning, Mark woke to the gentle sounds of the women preparing breakfast, their voices mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire. What had once felt strange now seemed as natural as breathing. The cabin, no longer just a shelter, had transformed into something warmer, a true home. Amanda's leadership continued to inspire everyone. She organized the women's quilt making with careful precision, ensuring each piece told a story of faith and perseverance. Their handiwork, rich with traditional patterns and skilled stitching, found eager buyers in town. The steady income meant full bellies and extra supplies for all. The old church on the ridge flourished under their care. Mark spent hours repairing broken windows and crafting sturdy wooden benches from fresh-cut pine. Amanda directed the placement of new oil lanterns, their golden light, making the once-abandoned building glow like a beacon in the evening darkness. The women scrubbed years of grime from the floorboards and hung fresh curtains at the windows. One crisp morning, Mark noticed unfamiliar wagons approaching the church. His first instinct was caution, but as they drew closer, he recognized settlers from neighboring homesteads. They came slowly at first, drawn by curiosity about the strange group living on the ridge. But Amanda's gentle welcome and the women's sincere friendliness soon put them at ease. Children's voices began to fill the air during afternoon lessons. Amanda and the other women taught them hymns, their clear voices rising in both English and German. Mark often paused in his work to listen, amazed at how the same building that had stood empty for so long now rang with such joyful sounds. The change in himself surprised him most of all. One morning, as several neighbors gathered for a wood-cutting bee, Mark found himself joining in their jokes and stories. His deep laugh, rusty from disuse, startled him as much as it did the others. But they clapped him on the back, including him in their easy camaraderie, as if he'd always belonged. "Never thought I'd see the day," old Jim Wheeler said, wiping sweat from his brow as they stacked fresh-cut logs. Mark Boone laughing like a regular fellow. "Those Amish women have worked a miracle on you, friend." Mark ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. Reckon they have, he admitted quietly. The real test of their growing acceptance came when the Millers, a young couple who'd settled in the valley, needed help raising a new barn. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads, and on the appointed morning, wagons began arriving from all directions. Mark hitched his team early, helping Amanda and several of the women load supplies for the day's cooking. The barn-raising site hummed with activity. Men gathered in teams to prepare the massive timbers, while women set up outdoor kitchens to feed the workers. Mark found his height and strength particularly useful as they began hoisting the heavy beams into place. The work was demanding but satisfying, each timber fitting perfectly into the growing framework. Amanda moved among the cooking fires with quiet efficiency, directing the preparation of enough food to feed the hungry workers. Every time Mark glanced her way, she seemed to sense his gaze, looking up to offer a small smile that warmed him more than the spring sunshine. By mid-afternoon, the barn's skeleton stood proudly against the blue sky. As the men secured the last crossbeams, someone produced a fiddle. Soon, other instruments appeared, a harmonica, a tin whistle, even a small drum. The work songs that had accompanied their labor transformed into dance tunes. Lanterns were lit as dusk approached, their warm light creating a festive atmosphere. Children chased each other between the adults' legs while older folks claimed seats on hay bales to watch the dancing. Mark stood back, content to observe until he noticed Amanda among her sisters, their faces glowing with happiness as they clapped along to the music. Something shifted in his heart as he watched her. She belonged here, among people who valued community and hard work. And perhaps, he dared to think, he belonged here too. When the musicians struck up a familiar hymn, Mark surprised himself by joining in. His powerful bass voice carried clearly above the others, causing heads to turn. But instead of the mockery he half expected, he saw only welcoming smiles. Amanda caught his eye across the crowd, her expression bright with approval. She made her way to his side as the song ended. "I didn't know you could sing," she said softly. "Neither did I," he admitted, least not where anyone could hear. "You should do it more often. Your voice adds something special to the music." The evening wound down as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Mark helped hitch his team to the wagon for the ride home. Amanda settled beside him on the seat, close enough that he could feel her warmth through the frosty air. Neither spoke as the wagon creaked along the familiar trail, but the silence between them felt rich with unspoken understanding. The other women rode in the wagon bed, their tired voices still humming snatches of the evening songs. Mark thought about how different this moment was from his solitary returns home in years past. Then only the wind and perhaps a coyote's cry had accompanied him. Now the wagon carried precious cargo, not just passengers, but family. As they approached the cabin, lamplight spilled from its windows in welcome. The structure that had once been merely a shelter had transformed into something far more meaningful. Each morning brought new purpose, each evening new contentment. The hearth that had witnessed countless solitary meals now gathered them all together, its warmth matching the warmth in their hearts. Once inside, the women moved through their evening routines with practiced ease. Some stoked the fire while others put on water for tea. Amanda organized the distribution of leftover food from the barn raising, ensuring everyone had a share of the day's bounty. Mark watched it all from his usual spot near the door, marveling at how natural it felt. The cabin's single room, which had once echoed with his loneliness, now rang with gentle laughter and quiet conversations. Even the shadows in the corners seemed softer, chased away by the light of community and belonging. Later, as the women settled in for the night, he heard them sharing memories of the day, the satisfaction of work accomplished together, the joy of music and dancing, the simple pleasure of belonging to something larger than themselves. Their voices grew softer as sleep approached, but the contentment in their tones remained. From his loft, Mark listened to the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the cabin, but now these sounds carried new meaning. They were no longer the empty echoes of solitude, but the comfortable noises of home, real home, filled with family and hope. The moon cast silver light through the window as he lay awake, his mind full of the day's images. But most of all, he remembered Amanda's smile in the lantern light, and the quiet warmth of her presence beside him on the wagon seat. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to imagine a future filled with such moments. Not just surviving, but truly living, surrounded by people who accepted him just as he was. The final embers in the hearth below glowed softly, a reminder of the day's celebrations and the promise of more to come. Mark closed his eyes, his heart full of gratitude for the unexpected gift of belonging that had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with purpose and joy. The joy of community proved fleeting. Under a moonless sky, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful night. Mark, who had been reading his Bible by lamplight, sensed the wrongness before he saw it. The rider's approach was too quick, too purposeful for innocent travelers. Through the cabin's frosted window, he spotted the first torch, its flame angry against the darkness. More followed, a dozen or more men on horseback, their faces hidden beneath pulled-down hats and bandanas. They weren't heading for his cabin, their target was the church on the ridge. "Amanda!" Mark's voice cracked through the quiet cabin. "Get everyone up. Trouble's coming." The women stirred quickly from their sleep, practiced in responding to danger. Amanda took charge immediately, organizing them into groups. "Get your shawls," she ordered calmly. "We need to—" The first crash of breaking glass cut through her words. Outside, voices raised in cruel laughter as torches sailed through the church windows. Flames caught quickly on the fresh-cut pine boards they'd so carefully installed. Mark grabbed his rifle and ran toward the church, his long legs carrying him swiftly through the deep snow. Behind him, he heard Amanda organizing the women to form a waterline from the creek. But even as they began their effort, more torches flew and the dry wood of the bell tower began to catch. "Stop!" Mark's voice boomed across the ridge. "This is God's house." The raiders turned toward him, and in the growing firelight he recognized several faces from town. Men he'd seen lounging outside the saloon, now doing the railroad's dirty work. One of them, a scarred man on a black horse, laughed openly. "Ain't nothing God's house once the railroad stakes a claim," he sneered. "Consider this your notice to clear out, giant, or—" Mark raised his rifle, but he couldn't fire into the crowd. Too many shadows, too much risk of hitting an innocent in the chaos. This moment of hesitation cost him dearly. While he struggled with his conscience, several riders circled behind him. The first blow caught him across the shoulders, sending him stumbling forward. He turned to fight, his huge fists swinging, but more men piled on. In the confusion, he heard screams, not just of fear, but of genuine terror. "Mark! They're taking Sarah and Rebecca." Amanda's cry cut through his pain. He saw two of the youngest women being dragged onto horses, their struggles silenced by rough hands. Mark roared in fury, throwing off his attackers with sudden strength. But as he lunged toward the kidnapped women, something hard struck the back of his head. The world tilted sideways as he fell. Through blurring vision, he saw the raiders galloping away with their captives. The church blazed behind them, painting the snow orange with reflected fire. Folk from town had begun to arrive, but they stood in silence, watching the destruction with passive faces. Mark, you have to move." Amanda's voice seemed to come from far away. She was pulling at his arm, trying to drag him from where he'd fallen. The smoke was thickening, making it hard to breathe. Above them, timbers groaned ominously. He tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Amanda's strength surprised him as she hauled him backward through the snow. Behind them, the bell tower gave a final shuddering groan. The crash of its collapse sent sparks spiraling into the night sky, and the bell gave one last mournful toll as it fell. The remaining women gathered around them in the snow, their faces streaked with tears and soot. The hymns they'd sung so joyfully in this place just hours before seemed a distant memory now. Some sobbed openly for their taken sisters, while others stood in shocked silence. Mark finally managed to stand, though the world still spun around him. Blood trickled down his neck from where he'd been struck, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shame that crushed his heart. He'd failed them all. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough with smoke and grief. I'm not worthy to protect any of you. Never was." Without waiting for a response, he turned and stumbled back toward his cabin. The women called after him, but he couldn't face them. Couldn't bear to see the accusation he was sure must be in their eyes. He dropped heavily onto the porch steps, ignoring the cold that immediately began seeping through his clothes. The fire continued to burn on the ridge, though it was burning itself out now, having consumed everything they'd worked so hard to build. Hours passed. Someone, he didn't look to see who, set a plate of food beside him. He ignored it. The night grew colder, but he welcomed the discomfort. It felt right somehow, that he should suffer. Just before dawn, he heard familiar footsteps on the porch. Amanda settled beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "You need to eat something," she said softly. "I don't deserve food," he replied, his voice hollow. "Those girls, they trusted me to keep them safe. You all did, and I failed." The only failure would be giving up now. Amanda's voice held steel beneath its gentleness. God's strength is made perfect in weakness, Mark. That's what the scripture tells us. He shook his head, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Don't quote scripture at me, Amanda. I've proved I'm no man of God. A real man of faith would have protected his flock. I couldn't even protect 2 innocent girls from being stolen away. You fought with all your strength," she insisted. "I saw you. But one man alone, no matter how strong, can't stand against such evil. That's why we need God's strength, and each other's." But Mark couldn't accept her comfort. The shame was too deep, the sense of failure too complete. "I've doomed you all," he said bitterly. "Once word spreads that they could take 2 so easily, others will come. The railroad will win. Everything we built. Everything we hoped for." His voice broke and he fell silent, staring at the lightening eastern sky. Smoke still rose from the church ruins, a dark smudge against the dawn. The sight drove the final nail into his heart's coffin of despair. Amanda stood, brushing snow from her skirts. Her next words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Whether you lead us or not, Mark Boone, we will not abandon our sisters." She knelt in the snow before him, her face lit by the first rays of dawn. "Dear Lord," she prayed aloud, "grant us the courage to face this evil. Show us the way to bring our lost lambs home, and help those whose hearts are heavy with shame to remember that your strength is sufficient for all our needs." She rose, her eyes meeting his directly. "We will find Sarah and Rebecca," she declared, "with or without your help. But I pray you'll remember the man God called you to be, not the man your fears tell you that you are." Mark remained silent, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of his failure pressed down on him like a physical thing, threatening to crush whatever faith he'd begun to build. Behind him, in the cabin, he could hear the other women beginning their morning prayers, their voices thin but determined in the cold dawn air. The smoke continued to rise from the ruined church, a stark reminder of all they'd lost. But Amanda's words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a choice. The sun crept higher, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. But Mark remained motionless on the porch, trapped between shame and the call to action, between despair and the faintest flicker of hope. Amanda's voice cut through the heavy silence of dawn. "We cannot waste another moment. Our sisters need us." She strode into the cabin, her steps purposeful despite exhaustion etched on her face. "Mary, Rachel, gather food. Hannah, find rope and extra blankets. Elizabeth, check our medical supplies." Inside the cabin, the women moved with quiet efficiency, but Mark remained motionless on the porch, his broad shoulders bowed under the weight of failure. Through the open door, he watched Amanda directing the others, her calm authority never wavering despite the crisis. She pulled their largest lanterns from storage shelves, checking oil levels and wicks with careful hands. The sight of her preparing for rescue, not cowering in defeat, stirred something in Mark's chest. Here was a woman who had seen him fail, yet still moved forward with unwavering trust that he would help. The paralysis that had gripped him began to crack. Rising stiffly from the cold porch, Mark entered his cabin. "The mule," he said, his voice rough from smoke and silence. "She's sure-footed in snow. We'll need her." Amanda looked up, relief flickering across her face. "Thank you, Mark. We trust your knowledge of these mountains." Her words struck him like physical blows. Trust after everything? But there was no time to question. Already the women were loading supplies into packs, their movements quick but measured. Mark stepped out to the stable where his mule dozed in her stall. As he worked to saddle her, his hands remembered their strength. The familiar motions of checking straps and adjusting stirrups helped clear his mind. By the time he led the animal to the cabin, Amanda had organized the group. "We'll follow the canyon trail," Mark said, studying the snow-covered ground. It's the only way they could have taken them without risking the horses in deep drifts. The morning sun cast long shadows as their group set out. Mark led the mule, now laden with supplies, while Amanda walked beside him. The other women followed in pairs, each carrying a lantern though it was daylight. Their breath frosted in the cold air as they moved through the silent forest. Tracks in the snow told their story, multiple horses riding hard, heading deeper into the canyon. Mark studied each mark intently, noting places where the captive women had clearly struggled. His jaw tightened at these signs, but he kept his observations to himself. The day wore on. They moved slower than Mark would have liked, but the women showed remarkable stamina. None complained about the cold or the pace. When they rested briefly at midday, they shared bread and dried meat in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. As afternoon faded toward evening, Mark led them to a sheltered grove of pines. "We'll camp here," he announced. "The horses' tracks show they're at least half a day ahead. We need rest if we're to catch them." While the women gathered firewood, Mark worked methodically around their perimeter, setting simple warning systems, tripwires with tin cups attached, branches balanced to fall noisily if disturbed. He'd learned these tricks years ago, living alone in the mountains. But never had they felt so vital. Amanda got a small fire going, its flames carefully screened to minimize visible smoke. As the group huddled close for warmth, she pulled out her worn Bible. Her voice carried clearly in the gathering dark. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The words seemed to settle over the camp like a blanket. Mark watched as tension eased from tired faces, replaced by something stronger. Not quite peace, but determination founded on faith. "Our God is a God of deliverance," Amanda continued, her voice steady and sure. "He led his people from bondage in Egypt. He saved Daniel from the lion's den. He guards his children still." She looked around the circle, meeting each woman's eyes. "Sarah and Rebecca are not forgotten. The Lord sees them, and he will guide us to them." The women nodded, some wiping tears, others clasping hands. Mark felt something stir in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Without conscious thought, he found himself speaking. "Lord," his voice cracked on the word, rough with disuse and prayer. "Lord, I'm not worthy to ask anything of you, but these women are. They're yours. Please," he paused, struggling, "please help us find your lost sheep and bring them home." Silence fell after his words, then Amanda's hand found his in the firelight, squeezing gently. "Amen," she said softly, and the word was echoed around the circle. Mark took first watch, pacing the perimeter as the women settled down to sleep. The wind moaned through the pines, carrying the promise of more snow. He checked his rifle, counting bullets by touch in the dark. The shame of his earlier failure still burned, but it was changing now, hardening into resolution. Near midnight, Amanda appeared silently beside him. "You should rest," she said. "I'll take the next watch." "I'm fine," he started to protest, but she cut him off. "You're the tracker, Mark. We need you clear-headed tomorrow." She paused, then added quietly, "You're the protector God provided for us. I believe that now more than ever." Even after I failed, the words escaped before he could stop them. "You didn't fail," Amanda's voice was firm. "You fought with all your strength, and now you're leading us to bring them home. That's not failure. That's faithfulness." Mark stood silent, letting her words sink in. The wind stirred the pines again, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. But here in their small camp, watching Amanda's face in the dying firelight, he felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope fragile as a candle flame, but real. "Get some rest," Amanda said again, gentler now. "God's mercy is new every morning. Tomorrow we'll need all the strength he provides." As Mark finally lay down near the banked fire, he heard Amanda beginning to hum softly, an old hymn about God's deliverance. The tune followed him into sleep, and for the first time since the church burning, his dreams were not haunted by shame. The wind continued its mournful song through the pines, but in their protected grove, the small group slept in peace, their faith a stronger shelter than any walls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they rested in the knowledge that they did not face them alone. The eastern sky barely showed its first blush of dawn when Mark roused the camp. Frost coated their blankets, and the women moved stiffly in the bitter cold. Amanda organized them quickly, distributing dried meat and hard biscuits for a simple breakfast while Mark studied the tracks in the new fallen snow. "Trail's still clear," he reported, pointing to deep hoofprints heading deeper into the canyon. "The fresh powder will slow them down. Might be our chance to catch up." They broke camp efficiently, leaving no trace of their presence except trampled snow. Mark led them single file along the canyon wall, where the drifts were shallowest. The mule picked its way carefully, laden with their supplies and lanterns. The morning sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows across the snow-filled canyon. Massive snowdrifts blocked their path at times, forcing them to backtrack and find new routes. Mark's heart clenched each time they had to delay, knowing every minute counted. Amanda had organized a system of lantern signals the previous night: 1 flash for danger, 2 for help needed, 3 for gathering the group. The women carried their lanterns ready, even in daylight. When the group stretched too far apart on narrow paths, quick flashes of light helped them regroup. "Careful here," Mark called back as they navigated a treacherous slope. Ice under the snow. The women linked arms, supporting each other across the slick ground. Their cooperation moved Mark deeply. No complaints, no fear, just steady determination to rescue their sisters. By midday, the canyon walls had drawn closer, creating a natural funnel. Mark held up his hand, stopping the group. A thin thread of smoke rose ahead, barely visible against the gray sky. "Wait here," he whispered to Amanda. "I'll scout ahead." She nodded, gathering the women into a protected hollow. Mark dropped to his belly and began crawling through the brush, moving as silently as years of hunting had taught him. The bitter cold bit through his clothes, but he ignored it, focusing only on staying hidden. After 20 minutes of careful movement, he reached a position overlooking the kidnappers' camp. 4 men lounged around a small fire, passing a bottle between them. Their horses stood nearby, stamping restlessly in the snow. The sight that made his blood boil was Sarah and Rebecca, bound hand and foot, huddled together against a boulder. They looked cold, but alive, their bonnets still firmly in place despite their ordeal. Mark counted weapons. 3 rifles leaned against a log, and he spotted pistols on at least 2 men. Taking on all 4 directly would be suicide. He studied the layout carefully, memorizing every detail before retreating. Amanda met him at the edge of their group. "What did you see?" He described the camp in low tones, watching her face as she absorbed the details. "We'll need a distraction," he concluded. "Something to draw them away from Sarah and Rebecca, while I cut them free." "I'm coming with you," Amanda said firmly. Mark started to protest, but she cut him off. "You'll need someone to help them while you handle the men." "I'm coming." Her tone brooked no argument. Mark found himself nodding, impressed again by her quiet strength. Together, they developed a plan. As dusk approached, the women gathered sagebrush and green pine boughs. "Smoke signals were common among the native peoples here," Mark explained. "We'll use them to confuse those men. They're drunk enough now, it should work." They positioned 3 groups of women around the camp, each with materials to create thick smoke when signaled. Amanda and Mark crept closer to the camp, using the growing darkness for cover. The kidnappers had drunk steadily all day. Their loud voices carried clearly in the still air. Mark gave the signal. Smoke began rising from 3 directions, thick and purposeful. The men in camp noticed immediately, their shouts turning anxious. "Indians? Like, spread out, check it out, yo. Don't leave the women." 2 men stumbled off to investigate while 2 remained in camp, rifles ready. Mark touched Amanda's arm and pointed. Now was their chance. They crept forward as the remaining guards argued about which smoke signal to check first. Mark reached Sarah and Rebecca first. They stiffened at his touch until they recognized him. He pressed a finger to his lips and began sawing at their ropes with his knife. Amanda kept watch, her body tense. The ropes had just fallen free when a shout went up. One of the guards had spotted them. Mark spun, launching himself at the man before he could raise his rifle. They crashed together into the snow, wrestling for control. The man was strong despite his drunkenness, landing several solid blows. They rolled dangerously close to the fire. With a surge of desperate strength, Mark managed to flip his opponent, sending him sprawling into the burning logs. The man's scream split the night as his clothes caught fire. He ran blindly into the darkness. Amanda was already leading Sarah and Rebecca away when the second guard emerged from the trees. He raised his pistol, But before he could fire, a wall of sound hit him. Hymns, sung at full volume by all the women. The sudden noise in the darkness seemed to come from everywhere. The man spun in confusion. "The Lord is my shepherd," the voices rang out strong and fearless. "I shall not want." More voices joined from different directions, creating a disorienting chorus. The remaining kidnapper fired wildly into the dark, then turned and fled, leaving everything behind. Mark scooped up the abandoned rifles, then hurried to join the women. They regrouped quickly in the growing darkness, supporting Sarah and Rebecca, who were stiff from their bonds. No one spoke as they moved away from the camp, putting distance between themselves and any returning kidnappers. Only when they had traveled for an hour did Mark call a halt in a defensible position. The women crowded around Sarah and Rebecca, checking them for injuries, sharing water and blankets. Amanda organized it all calmly, but Mark saw tears in her eyes as she embraced her rescued sisters. He stood watch, rifle ready, as the women tended to each other. Pride filled his chest, not the foolish pride that had shamed him before, but something deeper. He was proud of their courage, their unity, their faith that had literally become a weapon against evil. Sarah and Rebecca told their story in quiet voices, how they'd been dragged away during the church fire, how they'd prayed constantly for rescue, how they'd never lost faith that their sisters would come for them. Mark listened while scanning the darkness, knowing that 4 angry men might still be out there. Wounded pride added to their drunken rage. Amanda joined him on watch, her shoulder brushing his arm. "Thank you," she said softly. "God used your strength today." Mark nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the night, while behind them the women softly sang hymns of gratitude. The battle wasn't over. They all knew that. But for this moment, victory tasted sweet as honey on their tongues. The canyon walls rose black against the star-filled sky, and the wind carried the scent of snow. Mark checked his rifle again, ready for whatever might come. They had won this fight through cunning and courage, through faith and unity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The moon cast long shadows through the canyon pines as Mark led the group deeper into the protective embrace of the forest. Every cracking twig made them start, their nerves still raw from the rescue. The freed women, Sarah and Rebecca, stumbled with exhaustion, supported by their sisters' steady arms. "Here," Mark said finally, gesturing to a natural hollow where 2 fallen logs created a partial shelter. "We can rest until dawn." Without being told, the women fell into their practiced roles. Some gathered pine boughs while others cleared snow from the ground. Mark worked quickly, lashing branches together to create a lean-to against the bitter wind. His big hands, usually so clumsy around the women, moved with purpose and skill. Amanda unpacked her medicine bag, her face grave as she examined Sarah and Rebecca by lantern light. "These rope burns need tending," she murmured, pulling out dried herbs and clean cloth. "Martha, heat some water, please." Mark kept his distance as Amanda worked, but he couldn't help watching her gentle movements as she cleaned the angry welts on the women's wrists and ankles. She crushed herbs between her fingers, mixing them with melted snow to make a poultice. Her patients winced at first, then sighed with relief as the medicine did its work. "The Lord provides healing plants even in winter," Amanda said softly, binding the poultices in place. "Rest now, sisters. You're safe." The group huddled close around a small, carefully shielded fire. They shared the last of their journey bread, more for comfort than sustenance. No one spoke much, but their eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond their circle of light. Mark took up his rifle and paced the perimeter, checking his trap lines. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his broad shoulders. These women trusted him with their very lives. The thought both terrified and strengthened him. "Mark," Amanda's voice called him back to the fire. "Come sit, you need rest too." He hesitated, then settled his large frame beside her, careful to leave proper space between them. The firelight caught the silver threading through her dark hair, and his heart clenched with emotions he couldn't name. "I almost lost you all today," he said roughly, staring into the flames. "When I saw that church burning, when they took Sarah and Rebecca, I've never felt so helpless." Amanda's hand found his in the darkness. Her touch was warm, steady. "But you didn't lose us. God guided our path today, every step." "I'm beginning to believe that," Mark admitted. "All these years alone, I thought I was hiding from him." But maybe he was just waiting for the right time to show me my purpose. "Faith without works is dead," Amanda quoted softly. "You've proven your faith through action, Mark. You could have stayed safe in your cabin, but you chose to fight for what's right." Her words washed over him like healing balm. Around them, the women had begun humming hymns, their voices barely above a whisper but full of gratitude. Mark felt something shift inside his chest, as if a great weight was lifting. They dozed in shifts through the long night, Mark and Amanda taking turns at watch. As false dawn began to paint the sky, they broke camp efficiently, erasing all signs of their presence. There was no discussion about their next move. They all knew they had to face what waited in town. "We walk in openly," Mark declared, checking his rifle one last time. "No more hiding." The women straightened their bonnets and brushed what they could of the soot from their dresses. Even exhausted, they carried themselves with dignity. Mark took point, with Amanda beside him, as they began the long march back to civilization. The morning sun was well up when they crested the last ridge. Below, the town sprawled in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys into the crystal air. Mark felt the women's anxiety as they began their descent, but there was no hesitation in their steps. People stopped to stare as they entered town. Mark heard the whispers, saw fingers pointing at their bedraggled appearance, the soot-stained dresses, the bandaged wrists, his own bruised face. But where he once would have hunched his shoulders and hurried past, now he walked tall. "Look at them," a man sneered from the saloon doorway, "the giant in his prayer meeting." Mark turned slowly to face him. "That's right," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly. "Got a problem with that?" The man's smile faltered at something he saw in Mark's eyes. He stepped back into the shadows of the saloon. They walked the length of the main street, heads high. Some townsfolk quickly looked away, ashamed perhaps of their inaction during the church burning, but others nodded respectfully, and the kind grocer who had helped them before touched his hat as they passed. Amanda led them straight to the ruins of their church. The walls still stood, scorched but solid, reaching blackened beams to the sky. The windows gaped like empty eyes, but the stone foundation remained unshaken. "This is where we belong," Amanda declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is where we make our stand." The women began clearing debris, salvaging what they could. Mark helped them raise a temporary shelter of canvas and boards within the sturdy walls. As darkness fell, they lit lanterns that glowed defiantly through the broken windows. "We'll rebuild," Amanda said, standing in what had been the church doorway. Stronger than before, she began to sing, her clear voice lifting into the night air. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. One by one, the other women joined in, their harmony swelling in the darkness. Mark stood quietly, feeling the power of their faith vibrate in his chest. Then Amanda turned to him, her eyes shining in the lantern light, and held out her hand. For the first time in his life, Mark sang without shame or hesitation. His deep bass voice anchored their song, steady and proud as the mountains themselves. The hymn echoed across the ridge, carrying their message of defiance and hope to friend and foe alike. They would not be driven out. The lanterns burned late into the night, golden beacons in the ruins of their church. Mark watched over his flock, rifle across his knees, peace in his heart. Whatever came next, he knew his place at last, not hiding alone in the wilderness, but here, protecting these brave souls who had taught him the true meaning of strength. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and gold as Mark and Amanda made their way down the muddy street toward the sheriff's office. Their boots left deep prints in the half-melted snow, marking their path like a testament. Mark's jaw was set with determination, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Amanda walked beside him, her dark dress and white cap pristine despite their ordeal, her bearing as straight as a pine tree. "The Lord goes before us," Amanda murmured, her voice steady. "Remember that, Mark." He nodded, grateful for her presence. The sheriff's office loomed ahead, its weather-beaten boards and crooked sign a mockery of true justice. Mark had avoided this place for years, preferring solitude to confrontation. But that time was past. Inside, Sheriff Clay Dobbs sat with his boots propped on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He barely glanced up as they entered. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man and his prayer leader," Dobbs drawled, letting his boots thump to the floor. "Come to complain about your burnt-up church? Shame about that. Accidents happen." Mark's fists clenched, but Amanda's calm voice cut through the tension. "We have come for justice, Sheriff Dobbs. 2 of our sisters were taken by force. Our church was deliberately burned. These are crimes that cannot be ignored." Dobbs laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "Justice? Railroad owns the law around here, missus. Your kind ain't welcome. Should have moved on when you had the chance." "The law belongs to God and the people," Amanda replied firmly. "Not to men who can be bought with gold." The sheriff's face darkened. He stood slowly, hand drifting toward his gun. "That sounds like slander to me. Dangerous talk." Mark stepped forward, placing himself between Amanda and Dobbs. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Touch that gun, and it'll be the last mistake you make." Through the office windows, they could see people gathering in the street. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation. Faces pressed against the dusty glass, and the murmur of voices grew louder. Sarah and Rebecca, the freed women, pushed through the office door. Their bandaged wrists stood out starkly against their dark dresses. "We can describe every man who took us," Sarah declared, her voice shaking but determined. "Every blow they struck, every cruel word they spoke. Will you deny our testimony, Sheriff?" The crowd outside had grown larger. The door stood open now, and people filled the doorway, straining to hear. Among them stood Jacob Miller, a respected rancher whose spread lay east of town. "I've known Mark Boone 15 years, Miller spoke up, his voice carrying clearly. "Never known him to lie or raise his hand in anger without cause. If he says there was wrong done, I believe him." The kind grocer, Samuel Webb, stepped forward next. "These women have brought nothing but peace and honest trade to our town. I've seen the railroad men harassing them, seen the sheriff turn a blind eye. Ain't right, and we all know it." Dobbs's face had grown red with fury and something else, fear. He could feel control slipping away as more townspeople added their voices to the protest. "This is sedition." A well-dressed man in a railroad company coat pushed through the crowd. "These people are obstructing progress. Sheriff, I demand you clear them out." But the tide had turned. The townspeople pressed closer, their faces set with determination. Years of railroad bullying had left its mark, and they had found their moment to resist. Mark stood at his full height, no longer the shrinking giant who avoided attention. "We will not be moved," he declared, his deep voice filling the small office. "Not by threats, not by fire, not by false law. God has given us this place, and here we'll stay." A cheer went up from the crowd. The railroad man backed away, looking uncertain. Sheriff Dobbs's hand had fallen from his gun, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. Amanda stepped forward, her quiet voice somehow carrying over the noise. "We invite you all to join us in rebuilding our church, not just for us, but for everyone who seeks peace and true justice in this town." The sheriff tried one last bluster, "Now see here," but no one was listening anymore. The townspeople were talking among themselves, making plans. Jacob Miller was already offering timber from his land. The grocer's wife spoke of organizing a dinner for the workers. Dobbs stood alone behind his desk, his authority evaporating like morning mist. The railroad man had already slipped away through the back door. With a final glare of impotent rage, the sheriff grabbed his hat and retreated into his private office, slamming the door behind him. The victory was not marked with shouts or celebration. Instead, a sense of quiet purpose filled the air. People began drifting toward the burned church site, as if drawn by an invisible force. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in flames, wagons began arriving at the ruined church. They came loaded with lumber, tools, nails, whatever people could spare. Women brought baskets of food and men rolled up their sleeves, ready to work. Mark stood with Amanda, watching as their neighbors unloaded supplies. The women who had suffered so much beside them were weeping now, but these were tears of joy and gratitude. "Look," Amanda whispered, touching Mark's arm. Her eyes shone in the fading light. "God has turned our enemies into allies, just as he promised in Scripture." Mark felt his throat tighten with emotion. All around them, people who had once turned away in suspicion were now greeting each other as friends. The walls that had divided them, between faiths, between backgrounds, between longtime residents and newcomers, were crumbling like the ashes of the old church. A group of men had already begun clearing the burned timbers, while others discussed plans for a stronger foundation. The women organized a cooking area, and the smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Children ran playing between the workers, their laughter a healing balm to recent wounds. Mark bowed his head, overwhelmed by the transformation. Amanda's hand remained on his arm, warm and reassuring. Together, they watched their community being born anew, stronger than before, built on a foundation of shared courage and conviction. The last light of day faded into dusk, but lanterns sprang up around the worksite, pushing back the darkness. The sound of hammers and saws mingled with hymns and conversation, a symphony of renewal that echoed across the valley. The spring air rang with the sound of hammers and saws as the new church took shape. Where ashes had marked defeat, hope now rose beam by beam. Farmers from the valley brought fresh-cut timber, while Ute families contributed skilled hands and knowledge of local stone. Even the skeptical townsfolk joined in, their former suspicion transformed into shared purpose. Mark's massive frame moved among the workers like a living crane, hoisting heavy beams into place. His muscles burned, but his heart felt light. Each timber raised was another victory over the darkness that had tried to destroy them. Amanda organized the work crews with gentle efficiency, making sure no one went hungry. Her cooking fire became the heart of the site, where tortillas from Mexican families met Ute flatbread and Amish dumplings. The aroma of coffee and stew drew workers together during breaks, breaking down old barriers over shared meals. As twilight settled one evening, Amanda found Mark sitting alone on a stack of lumber. She settled beside him, her quiet presence comforting as always. "You know," she said softly, "being untouched by romance does not make you less worthy. God has preserved you for his purpose." Mark's throat tightened. "I used to feel such shame," he whispered, "like I was less than a man. But now? Now." He looked at their growing church, at the community gathered around evening fires. "Now I feel no shame. God had his reasons." Amanda's smile was gentle in the fading light. "True love is not about possession, Mark. It is about sacrifice. You have shown that in abundance." The next day, a wagon arrived carrying a gift from the settlers, a gleaming bronze bell. As it was raised into the new bell tower, its clear tone rang across the valley for the first time. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Mark felt tears on his cheeks. Amanda's hand found his, squeezing gently. Looking at the faces around him, Ute and settler, farmer and townsfolk, all united in purpose, Mark realized he had found something greater than he had ever dreamed. He had found family. The last snow of winter melted under a strengthening sun as the church stood completed against the Colorado sky. Each evening, warm light spilled from its windows while voices lifted hymns to heaven. The wooden walls raised by many hands gleamed with fresh paint and pride. On dedication day, wagons and horses filled the clearing as settlers, Ute families, and townsfolk gathered in unprecedented harmony. Amanda's clear voice led the women in Amazing Grace, their German and English verses blending sweetly. Mark stood at the broad doorway, his massive frame now a welcome sight as he greeted each arrival with quiet dignity. Even Sheriff Dobbs came, hat in hand, humbled by the sight of so many united in purpose. Inside, sunlight streamed through new windows onto tear-streaked faces as scripture and song filled the space. Joy overflowed in every heart, healing old wounds between neighbors. After the service, Amanda and Mark stood together on the front steps, receiving thanks from those whose lives they had touched. Children chased each other through patches of lingering snow while colorful quilts, symbols of their journey, hung bright against the late winter sky. As evening approached, the entire group made their way to Mark's cabin for a final shared meal. The table groaned under dishes brought by every family. Cornbread beside native flatbread, settler stew alongside Amish dumplings. Amanda's prayer rose clear in the lamplight. "Lord, we thank you for Mark's protection, for making his home our refuge." Mark bowed his head, tears falling freely now. The cabin that had known decades of loneliness now rang with laughter and conversation. Children played in corners where he had once sat alone with his Bible. Women chatted by the hearth where he had cooked solitary meals. The firelight danced on log walls that would never again know silence, and Mark knew at last what it meant to belong. The night settled softly over the Colorado highlands as winter's grip finally began to loosen. Small rivulets of melting snow trickled down the slope, their quiet music mixing with the evening breeze. Fresh buds, tiny and green, had begun appearing on the aspen branches, nature's first whispered promise of spring. Mark Boone sat on his cabin porch, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way they had never been during his years of solitude. The wooden boards creaked gently as Amanda Fisher emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She handed one to Mark, then settled beside him with quiet grace. Together, they watched thin smoke rise from the church chimney against the darkening sky. Lamplight glowed warm through the windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the melting snow. The sight made Mark's heart swell with gratitude. "I see so much ahead for us all," Amanda said softly, her voice carrying the steady strength that had guided them through their darkest hours. "We will build a proper trading post for our quilts. The children need a school. Many families have already asked. If we stay faithful, this peace will grow deeper roots." Mark wrapped his large hands around the warm mug, considering her words. "Never thought I would have this," he said finally. "No wife, no children of my own. Spent 40 years believing that made me less somehow." He paused, watching the church lights flicker. "But God had different plans. Gave me a family bigger than blood." Amanda touched his arm gently. "Your life has not been wasted, Mark Boone. It has just begun." They rose together, leaving their empty mugs on the porch rail. Side by side, they walked down the slope toward the church, where voices had begun lifting in evening hymns. The singing grew stronger as they approached, German and English intertwining, harmony rising clear and true in the gathering dusk. Mark paused at the church steps, tears gleaming in his eyes as he smiled. Golden lamplight spilled across his face, and for the first time in his life he felt completely at peace. He had found his place at last, here among these people who had become his own. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.